Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I wanted to talk about this book, Bavinck, a critical biography written by James Eglinton. This book came out in 2020, so just a couple of years ago. I've heard very, very good things about it from a number of people, so I had an opportunity on a recent study break to read this book, which was quite an undertaking. This is almost 500 pages, very significant work on a very significant figure. So for those of you who are not familiar, this biography is about the 19th and 20th century Dutch Reformed theologian Herman Bavinck. He is a name that probably 50 years ago, very few people, even within the realm of Reformed theology, would have been very familiar with him, but his name has become more and more familiar as his works have been translated from Dutch into English. So 20 years ago, this year actually, so back in 2003, Baker put out these 4 volumes of Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics, which is very much his magnum opus, and they've been translating his Reformed Ethics as well, which is a multi-volume work, uncompleted, but still very significant. A number of things he's written on worldview and stuff like that. So more and more material by Bavinck is coming into the English language. And with that have come a number of biographies about Bavinck, delving into his life. However, this biography kind of stands apart from those other ones. So before I get into that, though, let me talk a little bit about Herman Bavinck, and then we'll loop back into kind of how his legacy has been handled. Getting ahead of myself for a moment. So first off, who is Herman Bavinck? Well, he is a Dutch Reformed theologian, as I said, who is maybe most commonly known as a kind of co-laborer and contemporary with Abraham Kuyper, who was a very famous Dutch Reformed thinker. He was both a theologian in his own right, although more of a public figure. He was a journalist, he was a prolific author, a dynamic speaker. He went on to become the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. He was a newspaper editor. He founded the Free University of Amsterdam. Very significant figure in early 20th century Dutch culture in general, and has had a big legacy beyond that. Together, Bavinck and Kuyper are often seen as kind of the fathers of neo-Calvinism, which is a term that has come into common usage a little bit later, but maybe the way that people would think about it today is more transformationalist streams of Reformed theology that are trying to emphasize the impact of theology in general, Christianity, and then specifically Calvinism on all of life. So very famously, Abraham Kuyper was invited to come lecture at Princeton Theological Seminary, the Stone Lectures, and he gave a lecture on God's sovereignty, Christ's lordship over every square inch of life. And so that's the kind of broadly speaking ideas and so forth that Bavinck and Kuyper have become famous for. Although again, sometimes people will pick up bits and pieces of their ideas and abstract it from the whole of what they're doing, which is why books like this one can be so helpful. So let me talk a little bit about this book and how it situates in the landscape of biographies that have been written, in English at least, about Herman Bavinck. Bavinck, as I said, is a figure that was very significant in the Netherlands. And so after his death, a number of biographies were written by close family friends or acquaintances and things, which can give you some interesting insights, but they're obviously not scholarly biographies. Well, as Bavinck has been translated into English, there are a number of books that have been written trying to delve into Bavinck's life. However, there's a couple of things that mark all of those biographies. One of which is they tend to lean very heavily on some of those early personal remembrances by family, friends, and acquaintances, which means sometimes you get these stories or characterizations of Bavinck which aren't really rooted in primary sources, right? They're not coming from things that Bavinck has written, from his journals, from his letters, from his published works, anything like that. It's something that's more pieced together by someone's secondhand impression. Well, as anyone who studied history knows, there's a value in that kind of secondary source material, but when you're doing a biography, you want to root it in the primary source material as much as possible. And one of the things that has come out of a lot of those biographies is that the authors are introducing you to Bavinck, but sometimes there are just factual errors, right? Where they get things wrong if you go back and actually look at the records. And secondly, there's a characterization of Bavinck that has become very popular. Because one of the things that you need to understand about Herman Bavinck is that he is writing as someone who grew up in a very conservative, kind of separated, confessional branch of the Dutch Reformed Church. And yet, because of the nature of his mind, the nature of his education, the kind of work that he would do, he was someone who was very involved in the culture at the same time. So there's a sense in which he's a deeply conservative, traditional, and orthodox character, and yet also ways in which he's a very complex, modern character. And the way that a lot of biographies have tended to deal with that is to sort of present Bavinck as being almost schizophrenic. I saw one review that said it's almost like a Jekyll and Hyde kind of thing. You know, you have the orthodox Bavinck and you have the modern Bavinck. And so people will read through, you know, his Reformed dogmatics and look at how he handles things, and sometimes they'll say, oh, well, he's being conservative. Oh, now he's jettisoning that confessional heritage and launching off in this modern direction. And depending on whether you're more modern or more conservative, you know, orthodox, you'll pick and choose which parts of Bavinck you like. That's how he's sometimes been dealt with. Well, James Eglinton is a Scottish scholar, and he has studied deeply in the Dutch Neo-Calvinist tradition, and specifically Herman Bavinck, and wanted to write a biography that would be rooted in those primary sources. That's why this is called a critical biography. It's not critical in the sense that it's critical of Bavinck, it's saying critical in the sense that it's a scholarly work, and you definitely get that. This work is very heavily footnoted. I said this is almost 500 pages, but the good news is if you're an English reader, you can shave off a good chunk of that because there are just extensive footnotes, most of which are in Dutch. So I was able to skim those pretty quickly because I don't know any Dutch at all. So, but he's very much interacting with letters Bavinck wrote. He had an extensive correspondence throughout his life. He kept a number of journals that Eglinton is drawing from. Bavinck is a figure that was significant enough in his own time that newspapers were following him. At one point he went and traveled to America and came back, and people would pay money to just go listen to Bavinck talk about his journey to America, right? Things like that. So there's a lot of primary source material, and Eglinton has done a very impressive job of wading through all of that and constructing a coherent and cohesive portrait of Herman Bavinck. And what he's trying to do in this biography is to not only correct some of the factual errors of earlier biographies, but to really try and challenge this bifurcated Bavinck that people have bought into. This idea that there's kind of two people who are at odds with each other in this one mind. And what he wants to suggest is rather that Bavinck is complex enough to encompass both of these. And that what he's doing in his modern moments, if we want to put it that way, is not jettisoning his orthodoxy, his confessionalism, but rather attempting to integrate that into a modern setting, to deal with modern challenges, to answer modern questions. And in that sense, Bavinck becomes a much more complex figure and also a much more challenging figure, because what he's trying to do is what, in a sense, every Christian has to do, which is to think about how to take the orthodox, traditional, confessional heritage that we have as Christians, and especially if you're rooted in a particular tradition, like the Reformed tradition, as I am, then how do you take those things and bring them into your age, your time, your questions, right? And this is where, for me, this biography of Bavinck was very helpful and stimulating. Not only did it teach me a lot more about the man, not only did it challenge some of my understandings of who he was, but it also forced me to think about who I am, who I want to be as a pastor, as a thinker of a much lower caliber than Bavinck. But still, what he's doing is what we're all called to do in some sense. And Bavinck is an interesting character, again, because he grew up in a kind of separatist Dutch Reformed church that was very small, not as didn't have the reins of power, was kind of looked down on in society. You were mocked if you were part of it. And yet he went to study at kind of one of the main universities, you know, at Leiden. And you can think of it kind of like an Ivy League, you know, school, you know, very secular, very opposed to his ideas. And yet he went there, he did his work, he did his doctoral work, he did his scholarly work, And through that experience, he had interactions and lifelong friendships with people who disagreed with him on fundamental things, people who were relativists, people who believed that all world religions were just kind of anthropological, cultural things, that there was no God, that there was no authority of Scripture, that the kind of confessional teachings that they had been brought up with were just a sham. This was an age where in the Netherlands the culture was very much shifting, right? Secularism is coming in. There was a challenge of confessionalism and orthodoxy, sometimes because they were reacting against a dead orthodoxy. And Bavinck is interacting with all of those things. He's interacting with the kind of hyper-conservative separatists who want nothing to do with modern society. He's also interacting with liberals who are wanting to jettison traditional faith in favor of some sort of non-religious utopian society, which of course never actually emerged. And Bavinck is trying to chart a path for confessional, traditional, orthodox Christianity in the modern age. And as he's doing that, he's wrestling with all sorts of questions that can feel very modern, right? What's the relationship of Christianity to other religions? What's the relationship of the Reformed tradition to other Christian traditions? What is the role of women in the church and in society? How do you interact with issues of politics or culture? Does the Bible have anything to say to that? He's dealing with all sorts of things and doing so in an amazing way. One of the things about Bavinck is he has this just incredible mind to deal with so many complex issues. And as you read something like his Reformed Dogmatics, you'll see this, that he has read widely and everything. And one of the reasons why people get tripped up when they're reading Bavinck and they're trying to figure out, is he confessional or is he modern, is that he does a very good job of describing his opponent's viewpoints in a way that they themselves could affirm. And so in that sense, Bavinck is really, I think, a model of a kind of careful, nuanced, ironic, but thoroughly engaged thinker. And this is where I think Bavinck, for me, kind of grew in my estimation because, again, I've often heard his name linked with Abraham Kuyper. Kuyper's the bigger figure. He's the kind of dynamic figure. So I've always kind of thought, okay, Kuyper is like Luther, Bavinck is like Melanchthon, something like that. But I actually think there's a better way of understanding that, because I think one of the things that you see as you interact with Bavinck kind of on his own terms is that he's not just kind of following Kuyper and giving a scholarly veneer to it. He's really they're intertwined as thinkers, but Bavinck also stands as an independent thinker. And increasingly, as he gets older, and as Kuyper gets older, Bavinck is able to kind of gain some critical distance and distance himself from Kuyper at certain points. You think about some of the controversies around, common grace and what exactly does that mean, and presumptive regeneration, and some of those kinds of questions. Kuyper has his own eccentricities theologically, and Bavinck's able to wade through some of those things in a really helpful way. Bavinck also doesn't fall into a lot of the pitfalls of modern transformationalism, right? There's certain circles where transformationalism is very much kind of a dirty word, and I would say that I have my own set of concerns about modern transformationalism. But it's interesting to go back to someone like Bavinck, who many of those men would look to as a leader or a father, and say, he's not doing all the same things you're doing. There's some difference between what has developed and where things began. And so I think for all of us, whether you're a fan of transformationalism, you see yourself as part of that movement, or maybe you stand a little bit outside and have some criticism, Eglinton showed me that engaging with Bavinck firsthand on his own terms would probably be helpful for everyone in the discussion. So it's really just a wonderful book. I mean, very much is setting the standard for understanding this character, understanding Herman Bavinck, understanding his theology and his work, and is the foundation for any other work you'd want to do. So whether you're interested in Bavinck at a scholarly level, a lot of people are doing graduate work, PhDs and things, dissertations on Bavinck. You have to read this book. Or if you're just someone who's interested in church history, interested in theology, this would also be a really interesting book, because it forces you to engage with a thinker who is very complex, very nuanced, living in a time of shifting sands that feels very much like our own. And there's a lot for us to learn, both from the specifics of what Bavinck taught in his theology and his ethics as a pastor, as a theologian, but also just seeing him engage with the same kinds of struggles that we're engaged with. And even in areas where we may disagree with some of the things that Bavinck says or does, or areas where he comes down, there's a lot to learn from how he's working through those things. You get to see a great mind struggling with the same situations that you're going to struggle with if you're an Orthodox Christian in a modern age. So for all of those reasons, I would highly, highly recommend Bavinck, A Critical Biography by James Eglinton.